Wyoming Territory, late September 1884. The wind howled low across the Sweetwater Plains, lifting dust off the dry earth as if the land itself was exhaling after a long, painful summer. Hollis O'Connor gripped the reins tighter, her fingers raw from the cold. Her boots were soaked from crossing the last shallow creek, her skirts stiff with dried mud. Two children sat behind her in the wagon, curled together under a wool blanket. They had not spoken much since sunrise. Her voice cracked through the wind. "Almost there, Ada. Albie." "Just over that ridge." Ada, the older of the two, no more than 7, leaned forward. "You promise?" "I do," Hollis said, her throat tightening. "I promise." She had found them 3 days ago, alone in a burned-out homestead near South Pass City. A neighbor had sent word to the mission school where Hollis taught reading and figures. The children's mother had died of fever. Their father vanished into the hills weeks before. No one else came for them, so Hollis had. She was not their kin, not even close, but she had known what it felt like to be left behind. They made it to the edge of the ridge just past midday. Below them, the land rolled gently toward a small cluster of buildings nestled in a gully beside a narrow river, the town of Grady's Fork. It was not much, but it had a doctor, a dry goods store, and a man she had not seen in 12 years. Hollis stared at the town for a long moment. Then she clucked the reins and the wagon rolled forward. The blacksmith's shop was the 4th building in from the main road, across from the livery. The clang of hammer on iron echoed down the dusty street as Hollis approached. The man at the forge had his back turned, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands moving steady and sure. "Excuse me," she called. He turned. Broad shoulders, soot-streaked jaw, eyes the color of creek water in spring. Her breath caught. "Franklin Boone," she said. He dropped the hammer. "Hollis." His voice was deeper than she remembered, rough like gravel. "Is that you?" She nodded. Ada peeked around her skirt. Albie clung to her hand. He stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag. "What in God's name? What are you doing here?" She looked him straight in the eye. "I need help." He cleared out the extra room in the back of the smithy that night, brought in 2 cots and a stove. The children settled in fast, too tired to question the kindness. Franklin made coffee while Hollis stood by the window, arms crossed tight over her chest. "You look like hell," he said gently. "Feel worse," she muttered. He poured her a cup, handed it over. "You going to tell me what happened?" She sipped. "Found them alone. No one else would do anything." "So you did." "I had to." He leaned against the wall, watching her. "You always had a soft heart." She gave a dry laugh. "No, just a strong memory." He knew what she meant. They had grown up on the same patch of wild land near the Snake River. Her mother had been the schoolteacher. His father, the man who drank too much and swung hard when he did. Franklin had run off at 16. She had not seen him since. Until now. "You married?" he asked after a pause. "No," she said. "You?" He shook his head. "Never found the right one." Her eyes flicked to his, then back out the window. "I just need a place for them. A few days. Till I figure something out." "You can stay here," he said without hesitation. "As long as you need." The next morning, Franklin showed Albie how to shoe a mule. The boy's eyes lit up with each clang of the hammer. Ada watched from the doorway, her arms wrapped tight around her knees. Hollis stood beside Franklin, arms dusted with ash, hair pulled back. "He likes you." "Good kid," Franklin said, glancing at her. "Both of them." She smiled, faint but real. "You ever think about having your own?" he asked quietly. "I did," she said. "Before everything." He nodded. He understood what that meant. That night, Hollis sat beside the stove, mending one of Ada's dresses. Franklin was on the floor, Albie sprawled across his lap, fast asleep. Ada leaned against Hollis's side, thumb in her mouth. Franklin looked up. "You staying?" She paused. "I do not know yet. I think you do." She met his gaze. Something flickered between them, something that had not been there when they were children, but felt just as deep. "Why did you leave?" she asked. He looked at the fire. I had nothing to offer back then. No land. No name worth anything. Just fists and anger. I figured you deserved better. I never asked for anything. I know. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling low. 3 days passed. Ada began to smile again. Albie laughed when Franklin lifted him onto a horse for the first time. Hollis watched from the porch, arms crossed, heart aching in a different way. That evening, Franklin joined her as the sun dipped low. You remember the old apple tree behind the schoolhouse? He asked. She nodded. We used to climb it. You fell once, he said, grinning. Scraped your whole side. You carried me back. You cried the whole way. She laughed. I was 10. And I was 12. Thought I would die from the way you held my hand. She turned to him, eyes soft. You never said that. I did not know how. She looked away, voice quieter. I think I am finally ready to stay somewhere, Franklin. He stepped closer. Then stay here? She turned back to him, heart pounding. You sure? I have been waiting 12 years for you to walk back through that door, Hollis. I am sure. She smiled, slow and wide. That night, after the children were asleep, Hollis sat beside Franklin on the porch. The stars hung low, the night air cool and still. He reached over, took her hand. She let him. No words. Just the sound of the wind through the sagebrush and the quiet, steady rhythm of hearts healing. And finally, beginning again. The scent of cooling iron and sun-warmed sage hung in the still air as Franklin stepped out of the smithy just after dawn. He paused on the porch, rubbing the back of his neck while the day settled into its bones. The town was quiet. Grady's Fork always was this early, just the creak of a sign swinging above the general store and the soft clatter of hooves 2 blocks down where someone was hitching up a team. He turned his head at the sound of footsteps behind him. Hollis emerged from the side door, her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back differently than the day before. She carried a canvas satchel looped over one shoulder, stitched in a pattern that wasn't local. The edge of a ledger peeked out. I'm going to the schoolhouse, she said, adjusting the strap. They haven't had a teacher steady since last spring. I thought I'd ask if they'd let me help. At least until someone official gets sent out. Franklin leaned against the post, arms folded loosely. You planning on making yourself useful to the whole town before breakfast? She gave a dry huff. Idle hands aren't good for me. I remember. He nodded toward the bag. That ledger yours? My mother's, actually. I found it packed in the bottom of a trunk when I left Cheyenne. She kept notes on all her students' lesson plans. Some of her writings faded, but I can still make out most of it. He stepped down onto the dirt, brushing dust from his trousers. That's worth more than coin around here. She met his eyes. That's what I was hoping. He watched her go, the edges of her skirt lifting slightly as she walked. The morning light caught at the crown of her head, turning her hair the color of molasses. He waited until she rounded the corner before heading back in. Inside, Albie was awake and already tugging at the hem of Franklin's old work coat. 2 sizes too big for him, but worn proudly. Ada stood near the stove, stirring something in the tin pot with careful, deliberate motions. Franklin crouched beside Albie. You want to help me fix the bellows today? The boy nodded hard, eyes bright. All right then, but you've got to eat first. No one works on an empty stomach. Ada turned slightly. He already had bread. I made tea. Franklin raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He watched her pour into mismatched tin cups, her movements exact despite her size. Later that morning, the forge roared to life, and Albie sat cross-legged near the wall, watching every movement with the reverence of a boy seeing something holy. Franklin let him hand over nails, test the pump on the bellows, and even hold the rasp while he shaped a new shoe. The girl came outside after sweeping the back room, then settled on a crate, drawing in a small notebook she'd found among Hollis's things. She didn't speak unless spoken to, but she stayed close. By noon, the sky burned pale and cloudless, the sun casting sharp lines over the town. Hollis returned with red dust on her hem and a thin layer of sweat across her brow. She walked straight to the trough behind the smithy and dipped a handkerchief in, pressing it to the back of her neck. Franklin came around the corner, wiping his hands on a strip of cloth. "How'd it go?" "They weren't expecting anyone," she said, "but they said I could start with the little ones tomorrow. Just to see how it fits." He nodded. "You'll do fine." She glanced toward the children. "They seem better." "They are." Albie can't stop asking questions. Ada's quiet but watchful. "She always was," Hollis said, "even before everything turned." Franklin didn't press. The weight of the past still sat between them like a third voice. Instead, he stepped back and held the door open. "Come inside. I've got something to show you." She followed him through the smithy and into the back where the room she and the children slept in had been cleared further. Against one wall stood a narrow pine table, sanded smooth and freshly built. A stack of paper and a stub of graphite sat in the corner beside a cloth-covered jar. "I figured you'd need a place to prepare lessons," he said. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. "I had some scrap wood. Didn't take long." She stepped forward, running a hand across the tabletop. "It's perfect." He watched her for a moment, then turned away to hide the flush across his cheekbones. That evening, Hollis didn't sit beside the stove. She took the children out to the edge of town where the grass grew high and dry and the light turned the world gold. Franklin watched them go, then returned to his work, hammering out a gate hinge for the Cooper Ranch. When they came back, the children were quiet and sun-tired. Hollis stayed behind on the porch, watching the last of the light retreat along the hills. Franklin joined her a little later, the sleeves of his shirt rolled down now, hands scrubbed clean. He didn't sit right away but leaned against the railing, chewing on a sprig of mint he'd taken from the garden behind the coop. "I passed a man who knew your name today," Hollis said. He didn't look at her. "That's so?" "Said you helped rebuild his barn after the fire. Wouldn't accept payment." He tilted his head. "Didn't need payment." "You've changed," she said. "I had to." She didn't speak for a long time. "Then I didn't ride west for anyone but myself. I wasn't chasing answers. I just didn't want to be where everyone could see what he'd done." Franklin turned to her, his voice low. "You want to say it out loud?" She nodded. "He left me there. At the altar. Said he wasn't ready to be tied down, not to a woman who belonged in a schoolroom, not a home. Then he rode off with his brother's wife." Franklin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I sold the dress for train fare. Took what was left of my pride and went where no one knew my name. You did the right thing." She looked at him. "I didn't feel brave. Bravery's not about feeling it." She blinked once, then looked away. The silence between them stretched, not heavy, but solid. Franklin shifted his stance. "You ever think about what you want now?" "I did today," she said, watching Ada hold a slate like it meant something, watching Albie mimic your every move. He glanced down the porch toward the window, where the children lay curled beneath patchwork quilts. "They're yours now," he said. "I don't know if I'm fit for that." "You are," he said simply. She turned to him, eyes steady. "I'm not sure I want to leave." His voice didn't waver. "Then don't." The quiet that followed was not uncertain. It was the kind that came after a decision was made, even if it hadn't been spoken aloud. As the stars came out overhead and the air cooled, Hollis folded her arms on the railing beside him. "I don't expect anything," she said. "Not from you." "I know," he said. "But I'm offering something anyway." She looked at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon, the tightness around her mouth eased. He didn't move toward her, didn't reach for her hand. He just stood there, steady as the hills behind the town, and waited. She didn't say yes, but she didn't walk away. The first morning snow came quiet and without warning, slipping down from the sky like a hush laid over the plains. By the time Franklin stepped outside to check the horses, a fine white sheet had already gathered along the fence rails and wagon boards. He stood in it a long while, hands in his coat pockets, the cold threading through his boots until he could no longer feel the ground. Inside the smithy, the forge sat cold. It was too early to begin work, and the mule he'd planned to shoe had thrown its leg the day before and would not stand steady for days yet. Franklin let the stillness stretch around him, the solitude oddly welcome. Hollis came out from the back room just as the smell of coffee began to drift. Her sleeves were rolled down for once, cuffs buttoned with care. She had tied her hair in a single braid that hung low down her back, and her face held a kind of quiet that Franklin hadn't seen on her before, not grief, not weariness, but something nearer to ease. "I thought I'd walk Ada and Albie to the schoolhouse," she said, pulling on her gloves. "They'll be starting lessons with the others today." Franklin nodded. "I'll go with you." She hesitated just for a breath. "You don't have to." "I know." She didn't argue further. Ada and Albie were already dressed, their coats patched but warm. Hollis had sewn the lining herself the week before, stitching in silence while the children slept. They'd grown more comfortable in Grady's Fork with each passing day. Ada now shared her drawings without prompting, and Albie had taken to following Franklin through the smithy like a shadow. As they walked, the snow thickened. It wasn't harsh, just steady, softening the earth underfoot. The schoolhouse stood plain at the edge of town, one room, a stone chimney, and a crooked fence that someone had tried to paint once, long ago. A woman stood on the porch, arms crossed against the cold. She was older, with a narrow face and fair hair tucked beneath a knitted wrap. When she saw them, she stepped down and greeted Hollis with a reserved nod. "You must be Miss O'Connor," she said. "I am," Hollis replied. "And this is Ada and Albie." The woman gave the children a brief glance. "We're grateful for the help. I've been managing alone since spring. I'm Mrs. Talbot." Franklin stayed back, hands tucked in his coat, watching Hollis speak with the woman. Her voice was calm, her posture steady. It was the first time he'd seen her fully in her element, and it struck him how easily she fit among books and blackboards, as though teaching was not something she did but something she carried in her bones. When she returned to him, her cheeks were red from the wind. "She said I can take over the morning lessons," Hollis told him. "Reading and penmanship. She'll handle the rest." "That suit you?" "It does." They walked back with slow steps, the snow crunching underfoot. At the corner near the livery, Franklin paused. "There's something I want to show you." She followed him without question. The trail he took led west of town, where the land dropped gently into a cut of cottonwoods and dry creeks. The snow hadn't gathered much under the trees, their branches catching it before it reached the ground. A narrow path wound down to a clearing where a small log house stood, unpainted but solid. "I've been working on this when days are slow," Franklin said, stepping aside to let her pass. "Figured I'd have it ready by spring." She took 2 steps forward, then turned to face him. "You built this?" "Started after last winter. Figured I'd need something more than a cot in the smithy one day." She looked back toward the house. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and the shutters had been carved with care. There was no fence yet, no garden, but the earth around it felt claimed. "You planning to live here alone?" He stepped closer. "That depends." She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she asked, "Why show me now?" "Because I want you to know I've made a place where you'd be safe." "Where they'd be safe?" She turned to face him again, snow catching in her braid. "I never imagined settling anywhere again," she said. "Not after what happened. I'm not him. I know." Her voice was quiet. "But I didn't leave because he hurt me. I left because I couldn't bear the way everyone looked at me afterward. Like a woman who'd been passed over, was no longer fit to be seen. You're not invisible here. I'm not afraid here." He took a slow breath. "I've known your name since we were children, but I don't think I ever really knew you until now." Her eyes didn't leave his. "I used to wonder what became of you. I used to wonder why I left." She stepped toward him then, closing the space between them. Her hands were bare now, her gloves tucked into her coat pocket. She reached for his hand and didn't let go. "I want to build something," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for Ada and Albie. For me." He nodded. "So do I." She looked toward the house again, then back at him. "You think it's big enough for 4? It will be." That evening, Franklin waited until she had tucked the children into bed and the light from their room had dimmed. He stood in the kitchen, the ring nestled in a small pine box he'd carved himself. It wasn't ornate, a single stone set in a silver band, but it had weight to it, and he'd shaped it with his own hands. When she came out, he crossed the room and opened the box. Her breath caught just once. "I want to say this clear," he said. "I want you beside me. As my wife. I want to raise those children with you under a roof we built ourselves. I want a life that's honest and steady. Not just for a season. For always." She didn't hesitate. She reached out, lifted the ring from its bed, and slid it onto her finger. It fit. "I've never been asked like that," she said, her voice thick. "I've never wanted to ask before." They stood there a long moment, the quiet between them full and warm. The next day, the news moved through town slower than the snowmelt. Mrs. Talbot nodded once when Hollis told her, then returned to her grating. At the general store, the owner offered a jar of preserved peaches by way of congratulations. At the livery, Franklin's name was spoken with a kind of surprised respect. By the second Sunday of December, the ring on Hollis's hand had grown familiar. She wore it without self-consciousness, her touch gentler now when she held Ada's hand or brushed the hair from Albie's brow. Franklin began work on the fence that week. His shoulders sore by nightfall, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. One evening, Hollis sat on the porch of the smithy, coat wrapped tight, her eyes on the darkening sky. "I was never meant for what they expected of me," she said. He sat beside her, boots planted firm on the planks. "They didn't know you. You do." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. And when she reached for his hand, he was already there. The snow deepened over the next weeks, gathering along rooftops and weighing down fence posts, muffling the world until even the sharp clang of the smithy's hammer seemed to strike with more hush than echo. Hollis walked to the schoolhouse each morning, her boots crunching in the powder, her coat fastened high against her throat. Ada and Albie walked ahead of her now, together, no longer clinging to her sleeves as they had in the first days. The town had grown used to them. A nod from Mrs. Talbot, away from the boy who delivered firewood, it all stitched into something steady. Franklin worked slower in the cold, his hands wrapped in thick leather, breath fogging the air as he shaped hinges, wagon parts, and stove grates. He stayed late in the evenings now, not for lack of light, he had lanterns enough, but because work, in winter, gave the hours shape. Still, he found himself glancing toward the window more often than not, listening for the creak of the back door, the soft tread of Hollis's boots. She'd begun to read beside the stove after supper, legs curled beneath her, a blanket across her knees. Sometimes she read to the children, sometimes to herself. Always aloud. He liked the sound of her voice when her guard was down. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had fallen to coals, Hollis closed her book and looked at him across the room. "Were you ever in love before?" she asked. He set down the piece of harness leather he'd been oiling, stretching his fingers slowly. "Once," he said. "I was 16. She was older, worked in the boarding house kitchen in Lander. I thought she was the only girl who'd ever smiled at me without pity. What happened? She left. Took a job in Rawlins. Didn't say goodbye." Hollis tilted her head slightly, the firelight catching in her eyes. "Did it hurt?" "Not the way I thought it would. I think I was more in love with the idea of being chosen." She leaned back in her chair, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. "I used to think love was something you earned. Like good standing. Or respect." He didn't interrupt. "After I was left at the altar, I spent months trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. What I'd failed to be." Franklin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You didn't fail. I know that now," she said. "But it took crossing half a territory, losing nearly everything I owned, and finding 2 children in the middle of nowhere to learn it. You shouldn't have had to." "I did, though." He nodded. She stood and crossed the room, kneeling beside the fire to stir the embers. "I'm not afraid of being alone anymore," she said. "But I don't want it. You won't have to be." She didn't look up, but her fingers tightened around the iron poker. The next morning, Franklin hitched the wagon to the mule and drove out to the edge of town, beyond the cottonwoods, to the little log house he'd built. The snow had drifted high around the base, and the roof would need sweeping again, but the stove inside had held its heat. He set to clearing the path, then hauled in a sack of oats, a coil of rope, and the last of the dried apples from the smithy's storeroom. The house wasn't ready yet, but it would be. Later that afternoon, as he was brushing snow from the shutters, he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. "You could have asked for help," Hollis said, brushing a strand of wind-blown hair from her face. "I didn't know you had time." She stepped up beside him, her gloved hands tucked into her coat. "I make time for things that matter." He watched her as she surveyed the little house, the slope of the roof, the stone chimney, the freshly nailed door hinges. She stepped up onto the porch, testing the boards beneath her feet. Then she turned. I want to bring the children here. Not next month. Not in spring. Now. He didn't move. There's work yet. I don't care. He met her eyes, his breath clouding between them. I want them to know this is home, she said. Not just a place we're waiting in, but home. He nodded once. Then we'll move in before year's end. They returned to the smithy in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. That night they packed what they could: books, blankets, the children's few clothes. Hollis wrapped the ring Franklin had given her in a piece of linen and tucked it into the pocket of her coat. Ada asked why they were packing. Hollis told her they were going to live in a house with trees out front and a creek not far off where the wind didn't whistle through the walls. Albie asked if Franklin would still have his forge. Franklin said yes, but he'd be working shorter days. The move took 2 days. Franklin made 5 trips with the wagon, each time hauling another stack of firewood, or one of the cots, or a trunk of Hollis's books. Hollis and the children rode out last, wrapped in quilts, their breath visible in the air as they creaked down the road toward the trees. The first night in the new house, they lit the stove and boiled water for tea. Hollis hung 2 of her mother's old dresses across the windows until Franklin could build shutters for the inside. Ada helped fold the quilts. Albie dragged a stool to the hearth and sat with his chin in his hands, watching the flames. Franklin stood in the doorway, his shoulders dusted with snow, and looked at them. Hollis bent over the kettle, her braid falling over her shoulder, the children moving through the small room as if they'd always belonged there. He didn't speak. He just walked to the corner, took the ring from where she'd set it on the table, and placed it back into her hand. She looked at him, then slipped it onto her finger without a word. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Hollis and Franklin sat on the floor beside the stove, legs stretched out, backs against the wall. My mother used to say winter was a test, Hollis said, her voice low. That people show you who they are when there's nothing green, nothing easy. What do you think she'd say now? Hollis rested her head against his shoulder. That I passed. He didn't answer. He just reached for her hand. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the walls like a whisper, but inside the house everything held firm. The stove crackled, the quilts rustled faintly in the children's room, and the silence between them was no longer something to brace against. It was something to rest in. Morning came pale and blue-edged, and Franklin rose early to light the fire again. Hollis emerged not long after, her hair unbraided, her eyes still warmed by sleep. You ever think about naming this place? She asked, pulling her shawl tighter. I hadn't, he said. She stood at the window, looking out over the snow-covered land, the trees wearing white like quiet sentinels. We should, she said. Names give things weight. He crossed the room, joining her. You choose, he said. She thought for a long moment. Then, Stone Hollow. He nodded. It fits. Outside, the wind blew steady but soft, like a reminder that the world could be harsh but not cruel. Not always. And inside the small house in the hollow, laughter rose as the children woke and the day began. They had no need for promises. The life unfolding around them was its own kind of vow. The last of January burned out beneath a pale sky. The wind had softened some, but the cold held firm, threading through the seams of Stone Hollow and biting at boot soles and fingertips. Franklin had finished hanging the shutters that week, and the house stood tighter against the season for it. Inside, they lived without waste, with stacked high, meals plain but warm, the rhythm of days shaped by the stove and the schoolhouse, and the quiet work of living. One morning, Hollis stood at the wash basin, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands sunk wrist deep in cool water. A worn towel hung over her shoulder. She was humming something low and tuneless, not for anyone's ears but her own. Franklin, carrying in a box of scrap iron from town, paused in the doorway. You always do that when you're thinking, he said, setting the box down. I do what? That sound. Like a tune that's trying to be born. She smiled without lifting her head. It's just something my mother used to do, when her hands were busy and her mind was elsewhere. He crossed the room, brushing a curl from her forehead with the back of his knuckles. Where's your mind? She wrung the cloth out and set it on the edge of the basin. I was thinking about land. He leaned back slightly. What about it? If we're going to stay, and I mean really stay, I want to know what's ours and what isn't. The town's never been strict about boundaries, but if we're to plant a garden come spring and maybe keep hens, we'll need to be sure no one comes claiming the hollow. Franklin's expression sharpened with thought. The Homestead Act won't hold unless we file. I'd meant to before the snow. Then we'll do it, she said. Together. He nodded. I'll write to Lander next week. The clerk knows me. She dried her hands. And I'll mark the lines with Ada. She's good with figures. We'll run string and measure it clean. Albie burst in from the other room, cheeks flushed. The rabbit came back. The one with the white foot. Franklin tousled his hair. Keep your voice down, son. Your sister's still reading. Hollis glanced toward the back room. She's copying letters, not reading. But yes. Franklin crouched to Albie's level. You think he's nesting close? I think so. He ran under the woodpile. Then he's staying, Franklin said. Just like us. That night, after the children were asleep and the stove had burned down to a steady glow, Hollis reached into the trunk at the foot of their bed and pulled out a folded map creased, old, and marked in her mother's hand. She spread it across the table, smoothing it flat with her palms. Franklin came to stand beside her. You brought this all the way from Cheyenne? I didn't know why at the time, but now I think I do. He studied the faded ink, the hand-drawn lines, the notations in the margins. Your mother was careful. She believed in laying claim to things properly. Not by force, by care. He traced one of the lines with a fingertip. She'd have liked this place. She'd have liked you. He looked at her then, long and quiet. What about your father? He died when I was 17. He was kind and tired. He never wanted to leave the East. I'm sorry. She shook her head. He lived the life he knew. I'm trying to live the one I've found. They stood in silence, the map between them. The next week, Franklin rode to Lander. Hollis stayed behind, managing the house and school. She walked the perimeter of the land each morning, Ada trailing with string and chalk, Albie skipping ahead to scout for rabbit prints. They marked the line with stones and stakes, careful to leave room for the creek and the stand of cottonwood that kept the wind at bay. Franklin returned 3 days later with the filing papers, stamped and signed. He handed them to Hollis at the table. It's ours now, he said. Stone Hollow. By law. She pressed her hand to the papers, then to his. Then it's time. He tilted his head. For what? For a wedding. He didn't blink. You mean it? I've meant it since I put the ring on, she said. But now I want the rest of it. With the town. With our names written in the ledger and a paper on the wall. He pulled her to him, slowly, deliberately, resting his forehead against hers. When? Soon as the snow lifts enough for travel. I'll wear my mother's brooch. Mrs. Talbot has a dress she says I can alter. She offered it before I asked. I'll ask the preacher, Franklin said. He's still up near the post road. By early March, the thaw had begun. Mud lined the roads and runoff trickled through the hollow, but the days held more light, and the air smelled faintly of wet grass. They chose a date, plain and near, and made the arrangements without ceremony. The town gathered in the church on a clear afternoon, the wind quiet for once. Hollis wore the altered dress, her hair pinned with care. Ada carried a small bouquet of dried sage and wild wheat. Albie stood beside Franklin, his boots polished and his face solemn. The vows were spoken without hesitation. There were no tears, only the steady weight of truth in each word. When the preacher finished, Franklin took both of Hollis's hands in his and kissed her brow. The reception was held in the schoolhouse with pies brought in from the boarding house and coffee poured from tin kettles. No music played, but the room buzzed with quiet joy. Mrs. Talbot gave Hollis a carved wooden box, old and polished. Inside were lesson plans from her own first year. I thought you might carry on the tradition, she said. I will, Hollis told her. With care. That night, back at Stone Hollow, the children already asleep, Hollis and Franklin sat on the edge of their bed, the door open to the spring air. I never imagined a life like this, she said. Not even in South Pass? Especially not there. He ran his hand down her back, slow and sure. You're happy. I'm whole, she said. That's better. He turned to face her. I want to build something more. She raised an eyebrow. A barn, he said. And maybe a smokehouse. I can barter for nails. The lumber I'll cut myself. She smiled, touched his cheek. You love this land. I love what it holds. She leaned into him then, her voice warm against his neck. Then let's make it last. In the months that followed, they did just that. They planted beans and potatoes, built a henhouse from salvaged boards, and laid the foundation for a barn. The children grew Ada taller, more confident with her words, Albie louder, always moving, always asking. Hollis taught full days now, with Mrs. Talbot easing into retirement. Franklin worked the forge still, but only half the week. They found their rhythm. One summer morning, Franklin came in from the barn, sweat slick on his brow. He found Hollis on the porch, mending a shirt. She looked up, shading her eyes. There's a woman in town asking about teaching, he said. Says she's trained. Fresh from the east. Hollis set her needle down. You think she'll stay? If someone gives her reason. She tilted her head. You trying to retire me? You've earned it. I'm not ready. He sat beside her. One day, she said. That night, as dusk fell, they walked the edge of their land. The cottonwoods whispered above them, the creek running shallow beside their path. Franklin reached for her hand, and she gave it without thought. They paused near the far fence where the land sloped gently downward and the sky stretched wide. It's quiet, she said. It's ours, he answered. And in that stillness, with the land firm beneath their feet and the stars beginning to wink alive above them, they knew they'd come through the worst of things. Together. Always.